Morris Close, Associate Director of Connectional Ministries for Discipleship, and Laura McLean is on this webinar, and you know her, and many of you know her already, but she is a Associate Director for Connectional Ministries for Youth and Young Adults. So we will be leading this webinar together. There are a few others still coming in and joining us. This is a training to help you think through the guidelines and processes you need to have in place for your own safe sanctuary policy. We have updated it since we are here in the midst of a pandemic for a lot of the cyber safety video conferencing best practices that we have found useful over the last several months. Laura and I will be leading this together and taking turns sharing some of the slides. We are recording the session so that you can use the recording for your training with your local church leaders, or we will also make the PowerPoint available on the conference website along with the recording of this, as well as 3 other resources that we have. You'll be able to find these in the next 48, 72 hours on the conference web page under Safe Sanctuaries. But we will have the PowerPoint, the video of this training, as well as signage that has been created that you can easily take and just print off, copy off, and put around your the halls of your congregation, showing that you take safe sanctuaries seriously as a church. We also have a covenant sample that you might want to use or adapt to use with your own leadership, saying that your volunteers and staff are familiar with your church's safe sanctuary policies and procedures and are willing to follow that. And we also have a list of scenarios that we have often used in our trainings that we have done in person, so that your leaders can sit and discuss together the different scenarios and how you might handle that. So we are recording and we'll get started here. Welcome. Our purpose is to focus on ways that we can reduce the risk of abuse in our churches for our children, youth, and vulnerable adults. We began our training thinking about that this is a biblical mandate. Jesus said in Luke and in Matthew that children are welcome, and that we are not to put a stumbling block in front of children, but we are to welcome them in the name of Jesus Christ and include them and incorporate them into our ministries, but we want to be sure to keep our children and youth safe. The purpose of this training is to minimize the opportunity for abuse to happen in your church and organization. We're going to go through the key strategies that will enable you to keep children safe and ways to react responsibly and to respond to any incidences of abuse that might happen. As we begin, I invite you to think about those children in your own church, children and teens in your own church, in your own life that you feel responsible for and you are willing to protect. Just in your mind's eye, get the names and faces of those children and teens in your mind, and keep that in your mind as we go through this training. If you want to, feel free to jot down their names. Let's begin with the word of prayer. Invite you to mouth the prayer. It's hard to pray together over a Zoom call, but I invite you to mouth the prayer with me as we pray. Dear God, we thank you for the gift of children and youth, for children and youth to raise, for their lives to share, their minds to help mold, their bodies to nurture, and their spirits to enrich. Let us never betray our children and youth's trust, or dampen their hope, or discourage their dreams. Help us to enable our precious ones to become all you want them to be for the journey ahead. Amen. We recognize that the subject of sexual abuse, child abuse, is a difficult and complex subject. It's not one that we talk about on a regular basis, so it can make us feel uncomfortable. And we recognize too that oftentimes it might scare away church volunteers. I do admit that I think when we first started this, 10, 15 years ago, it scared more people than it does now, because whether it is in the school, scouting program, or any other organization program that our children and youth are involved in, parents really expect leaders to take policies and procedures seriously. And so even though it might still scare some church volunteers away, I don't think that is as critical as it used to be. But we all agree that child abuse should not happen in the church. But unfortunately, it still does. So we want to make sure that each year we are revising and looking at our policies and updating, particularly as we've gone through this pandemic, to think seriously about your own cybersecurity and what policies, procedures you need to put in place. We recognize that the definition for child abuse refers to any intentional act committed by a person in a position of trust, a parent, a caregiver, or any other leader in the church, which harms or threatens to harm a child's welfare or physical, mental health. We recognize any time an adult, whether that be a young adult, mid-adult, older adult, when they are working with teen children, they are in a position of trust, and they are a leader of the group. So any leader that intentionally abuses a child or harms or threatens a child is considered abuse. We recognize there are 4 types of abuse that we often talk about: physical, emotional, neglect, or sexual abuse. This training does not just focus on sexual abuse, but it focuses on the 4 types of abuse that are chargeable offenses in the community and can be prosecuted. We know physical abuse is any hitting, physical slapping, jerking, shaking that might happen. Emotional abuse is any putting people down, creating harm with our words, the way we treat one another. Neglect is the type of abuse that we just ignore and do not take and care for children or youth as expected. we leave children and youth alone, or other ways that we might neglect to care for the children or youth. And sexual abuse, of course, is any sexual act. And it does not have to be just restricted to penetration, but any kind of fondling, sex texting, anything that would be a part of a sexual act. We tend to think that this isn't a big problem, that surely it doesn't happen. But however, there are 3 million incidences of child abuse reported each year. And that means that one incident in every 10 seconds, 24/7. So we've been talking for the last 10 minutes. So we have already had hundreds of abuse that has happened over this last 10 minutes. And unfortunately, 90% of the victims know their abusers. 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys tend to be sexually abused by the age of 18. So unfortunately, it is a big problem. It is a problem that we as a church must address and continue to address. So why have a protection policy? A young child in the nursery develops their trust in God through their trust through their parents, through caregivers. And so we want children and youth to feel like the church is a safe haven. We want them to feel like that it is a safe place to be. And we want children and youth to grow up with a trusting, safe relationship with God. So by having a protection policy, we help reduce any of the risk of that and would help make that happen. The church should also be a place where children and youth are baptized, confirmed, and strengthened in the faith. And we want children and youth to know that they are claimed by God and part of God's wonderful, glorious creation. Most of churches that I'm aware of in the Holston Conference have safe sanctuary policies in place. However, it oftentimes gets put on the shelf and not looked at again. So if you've not looked at your safe sanctuary policy in the last couple of years, I would encourage you to take it off the shelf, dust it off, and review it. If you've not looked at it this year and thought about cyber safety, I would encourage you to re-look at it and think about what policies, procedures you need to put in place. I would also encourage, if you do not have a policy in place and you are still answering no to the on the charge conference form, that you reach out to Laura or myself, and we can help your church put a policy in place. Protection policies are not only for children, youth, and vulnerable adults, they're also to protect your church staff and volunteers. They're in place to protect families, and ultimately they're in place to protect the church. Believe me, you do not want your church to live through an accusation. It is just heart-rending, and I'm aware of churches that have gone through that journey, and it is not a journey you want to walk through and experience. So protection policies reduce the risk for children and youth, but they also protect the church and the church staff and volunteers, as well as the families. But more importantly, not only do they protect, but they empower you to take action. You have a policy in place that guides you and gives you and other leaders a way to react, a way to take action. It gives you examples on how to make those proactive choices, and it allows you to react and respond even when it is uncomfortable or risky to do. And as a whole, as your leaders are trained, as you're trained, you are able to support one another in the process. And to rely, if a question is raised about whether it's following a certain policy or procedure that's in place, it allows you to say, well, this is our procedure, this is in our policy, and this is what we must offer and provide. We have several checkpoints for minimizing the risk. First, you need to develop a written child protection guideline and procedures for implementation and enforce the policy as written. If it is a policy and procedure you've written and put on the shelf and not looked at, not even familiar with, failing to follow that policy is as bad as not having one to begin with. So you need to make sure that you're following whatever is written. If you are not following it, it's time to review your policy procedure and rethink how we can implement this policy procedure in a way that can be followed. Thus, everybody in the congregation needs to be aware of what your policy procedure is, especially staff and leaders. It's a good time at new member classes to provide a copy to new members as they come so they're aware. We have created the signs that you can place around your church to let people and be reminded that we take Safe Sanctuaries seriously. We invite you to have a yearly training and review with your leaders, and especially as you recruit new leadership, that they have an opportunity to know what is the policies and procedures in place, as well as in ministry information packets is another place to make that policy available. Basically, you just don't need it sitting on a shelf. You need it needs to be an active, vibrant doctrine and document in your congregation. Another checkpoint we use for minimizing risk is to screen all church staff and volunteers. Initially, this is where a lot of church staff felt uncomfortable. But again, any community organization that works with children and youth, volunteers are used to being screened and have been screened. We encourage that a rescreening be done every 5 years. You need to include a background check to check the sex offender registry. We have created a covenant statement for your volunteers that we'll make available on the conference website along with this information so that you can adapt and use it if you do not have a covenant statement already. That statement, again, just reiterates key policies and procedures. We require references and interviews, especially for staff, but it's important to know your volunteers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And you need to have a systematic way of supervising, whether that is you as a staff person supervising or key volunteers who've been with you and know the program, know the children and youth and families, but a way to have people in charge of groups and ministries so that that supervision happens. Another checkpoint for minimizing risk is what we understand as the 2-adult rule, and that it's 2 unrelated adults present at all times. That's the ideal. However, we know that sometimes having 2 unrelated adults present at all times is difficult. And so there are some ways to get around that and work through that. We do not advocate that this be on an ongoing, regular basis. Strive for that 2 unrelated adults, but when you absolutely cannot, have floaters in the hallways. I remember one church asking me, well, we have a floater that sits down at the end of the hallway every Sunday morning. Does that count? And I said, no, not really. A floater is a floater. It's one who walks around, who keeps tabs on what's going on. If you're just sitting at the end of the hallway, you don't know what's going on in the classroom. So a floater walks, a floater floats and moves around the hallways. Needs to be in line of vision. You need to have open doors or windows indoors so that that floater can easily look in and see what's going on in the classroom. When you are in a situation where you're out driving a group, particularly youth, you never have 1 adult and 1 minor. Some of the times we've gotten around this by having 1 driver and 2 unrelated minors, 2 unrelated children or youth. One time at a training, somebody suggested that when it was absolutely not possible, that they had on their cell phone the parent and the child and the driver, so that the parent could serve as that second unrelated adult to the driver and keep tabs of what's going on. You need to also keep sufficient ratios of the number of children and youth.
It seems as though Susan is frozen for a moment, so I'll pick up and then let her jump back in when she unfreezes there. But so sufficient ratios, that's just making sure that you have at least 2 adults for any number of children, but then past that, that you continue to have enough adults. And a lot of times those ratios look like 1 to 5 for elementary children, 1 to 7 for youth, or 1 to 10 for older youth. But again, keep in mind that that first 1 is 10. Okay, well, she's gone. So I'm going to share my screen here in just a second. Bear with me for just one moment. Technology is fun, isn't it? Let's see here. Here we go. All righty, get to where we were on there. Sorry about this, friends. All right, let me see. Here we go. And one more second, we'll be back. Okay. All right, I think we're ready. Does this look good to everybody? Look all right, like there's something back up there? All right, so back to, so we talked about sufficient ratios, And then the last thing there is that you need to cancel if there's no other option, which obviously that is no one's choice as to what we would do. But if you don't have enough adults, then whatever it is that you've planned just needs to not happen. Okay, here we go. The next one is the 5 years older rule. And so this says that anyone who is leading your group should be at least 5 years older than the oldest child or youth that they are supervising. So I personally think it's really important for us to be able to have opportunities for, say, youth to volunteer in the church, perhaps with younger students or college students to have an opportunity to work with youth and that kind of thing. And so this is not saying that they cannot volunteer at all, cannot be a part of that, but it means that they will not be the one in charge. So it would be that there would be 2 adults, and then in addition to this junior helper, volunteer, that type of thing, whatever it is you may want to call it. The next big checkpoint is the 6-month hospitality rule. And so this talks about that someone who is going to be a part of your ministry in a leadership position would be a part of your church for at least 6 months before they are invited to be a leader in your ministry. And as this says, it discourages people who can prey on our desperate need for volunteers. Who hasn't had, you know, let's say that 4th grade Sunday school class that we just can never find a teacher for, whatever it may be. And so when someone new comes in, we are tempted to say, yes, we would love for you, just come on in, just hop right in. But that is not a wise choice for us. So someone needs to be around and be a part of our church for at least 6 months before they are invited to work with young people. And as this says, an alternative is that they could intern or kind of shadow, that kind of thing for if they've been there less than 6 months. But there are still those other 2 non-related adults in the room as well. So keep in mind that this is good not only for our children and youth, but also for the people who are coming to be a part of our church, because we want to make sure that this is a good fit for them as well. So that is a good way to make sure that it works for all of us. Some special considerations to be mindful of and to think about are appropriate boundaries. And so for physical boundaries, you know, we talk a lot about, I'm sure you all have seen, you know, some satirical skits, which really are not all that satirical, but talking about the awkward side hug, you know, that we don't embrace children and youth on a full frontal hug, that, you know, have your arm around their shoulders, that kind of thing. And to remember that a physical touch for everyone is not a comforting thing. For many of our children and youth, unfortunately, they come from a background where a physical touch is painful and is not something that that would make them feel comfortable. So as you consider how you interact with these children and youth, keep that in mind. A pat on the shoulder, those kinds of things. Let the child or the youth initiate if there is a hug, those kinds of things, so that we can make sure that they are comfortable. Verbal boundaries, of course, nothing of a sexual nature, of an abusive nature, those types of things. But also, I think it's really important for us to remember what a huge impact we have on our students and our young people. If say a junior hire is a part of your ministry and you're playing games and it is at the expense of a student, you know, that everybody is kind of laughing at that, it can seem like it's all in good fun, but a lot of times it's not for that student who is the brunt of the joke. So I think it's important for us to remember what importance our words carry, and that we are leaders in their lives, and that we are supposed to be showing them Jesus, and when we are laughing at them, that is not a healthy way to do that. Emotional goes right along with that. as well as counseling, it's important for us to remember that I would dare to say the majority of us on this Zoom call are not trained counselors. And so it's important for us to remember our limitations in that. And so I would encourage you, when you are talking one-on-one or talking with a student, which of course, when we talk about one-on-one, that should be in a way that is seen by other, that can easily be seen by other people, but not necessarily heard. Because sometimes it is important for you to have a one-on-one conversation, but to keep in mind when that goes beyond your skill set. If counseling is something that is needed, it is important to refer that student or their parents, whoever it may be, to refer them along to someone who is a trained counselor. A thought about transportation, like Susan was talking about, another option is that you could travel in caravans. This is another option. So if there are multiple folks going together, but you don't have enough to have 2 adults in every vehicle, you could look at having travel in a caravan. So if somebody stops, then every vehicle stops. If somebody needs to go to the restroom, then all the vehicles go to the restroom, those kinds of things. So that is something to keep in mind there. And for overnight trips, it's really important for us. This is more often happens with youth ministry, sometimes with children, but for overnight trips, it's really important for us to think about what our rooming and housing situations look like. So if we are staying in a hotel, it's important that there is not one adult and youth in a room. There should be adults in rooms and there should be youth in rooms, but those should not be together. And so I know a lot of our groups have had great success in staying in, say, cabins for resurrection or something like that, where everyone can be in one house, but then have separate bedrooms for children and for youth and for adults and for young people. Let me hold on just one moment. Yes, okay. Just making sure that we are still good here. Okay. I think someone tried to join, so I'm going to try to let them in really quickly. Okay. All right.
Laura, I don't know why it's not. I got kicked off and then I can't share.
Oh, it's okay. I've got my screen up. Do you see mine?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that.
No problem. We just kept on going. So so we're here at special consideration. Let's see. Next we have, now mine's frozen. It won't go anywhere. My goodness, friends, I'm really sorry about this. Okay, here we go. So Susan, if you want to hop back in, you're welcome to.
One of the things we have said is when we're working with children and youth, both in the congregation and in the community at large, and if you have children and youth groups in your congregation, we encourage that the leaders still follow the church's safe sanctuary policies and follow the 2-5-6 rules to unrelated adults, 5 years or older, or 6-month hospitality rule of being a part of the congregation for 6 months. We encourage parent notification and permission when, particularly if you have groups outside your congregation, but that even parents need to be informed and given permission, especially if your groups are going off-site. Oftentimes, children with youth in the congregation, the parents give a blanket permission for participation in programs at the beginning of the school year and are given reviews of what steps you're taking to keep them safe. In this pandemic era, we are asking you to follow COVID-19 precautions that are put out by CDC, the state of Tennessee, as well as the Hosting Conference Task Force. And the task force has requested that each church have their own COVID task force that is thinking and keeping children and youth safe as well as families. And when it's possible, especially in this time, and to incorporate the entire family.
Susan, we've had a question in the chat box that I would love for us to take just a moment to talk about. The question is that, we've got two things. One, that don't forget that Virginia may have separate protocols, so it's important, and Georgia too, so important to look at your state specifically for those things. Thank you for that reminder, Brooke. And then Beth asked, if someone attends online right now for 6 months, hoping to volunteer with children when we return, how should we handle that? She says, I assume the 6-month rule is in person only. I would agree with that. I think that you need to have some in-person contact with that person before they are a part of the leadership of our young people. So yes, definitely. That's a great question.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right. We'll hop back in here. There is definitely a lag. My goodness, I'm sorry, friends. I'm clicking next and it's just saying where it is.
Were you having a lag earlier? It may be when I hopped back on, it was trying to.
It's just being a challenge today. If we need to, I may just stop sharing and we might just talk here in a minute.
Technology is wonderful when you have it.
That's right, when it works. Okay, here we are. And look at that, we're talking about technology now. So some best practices for social media. I think this is important for us to remember, especially now as we are moving more and more digital every day, it seems, whether we like it or not. That's our reality, right? So as far as actual social media goes, I think it is important for us to remember that the friending or the following or whatever that platform thing may be, that it's important for the student or the youth to initiate that. So we don't seek out being friends or followers or whatever it may be of the youth or the student. We let them lead the way on that. So they're inviting us into their world. We're not taking steps forcefully into their world. We need to all be mindful of privacy. So the church or the ministry platform is great for sharing information and those kinds of things on our social media sites. But important to keep in mind not to tag someone in a location. They may not want everyone to know that they are out of town or whatever it is it may be. Allow folks to tag themselves in our photos and that kind of thing. Also keep in mind, as far as sharing joys and concerns, that, I might share something with my Sunday school class, but I wouldn't necessarily want that on the internet for everyone to know. So let folks share their own joys and concerns unless you are specifically asked to share something from the church about someone. So keep that in mind for privacy. And then as far as photo sharing, we must have written permission from folks to share photos of their minor. So that could be a part of that annual permission form that Susan was speaking about. It could, be a part on there for someone to check that, yes, it is okay to share photos or videos of my student or of my child, or check if it's not. And you need to really keep that in mind as well when you are sharing pictures and videos. If someone has asked not to, then we don't do that. I can give one year at Assembly, we had 2 students who their parents had said not to share their photos. And when we got our group photo back, one of the students was right in the very front in the middle. And that's something that we print for everybody and we usually post online. So we just had to get creative, and we put a cross and a flame there that covered up that student so that we did not share their photo as was their wish. And I'm still trying to move to the next slide. Are there any questions or anything in the chat right now? Nope. Okay. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can just move through these a little quicker. We will make this available for folks to be able to see at other times, so that we can just keep moving. Another note on social media is communication. Keep in mind that there are public feeds and there are private messages, and it's a best practice for us to work within those public feeds, that we don't private message, because that's secretive. And that's one of the things that Safe Sanctuaries is really working to combat, is that secret closed doors kinds of things. We want everything to be out in the open. If you are texting or private messaging with a student, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and copy another adult, so that there or another student, so that it's not just that one-on-one communication. And counseling, like we talked about before, knowing our limits, but it's also important not to try to counsel someone online for hours and hours, especially if you are not a trained person in that. So move to a more traditional counseling setting for that. Okay. Next, of course, here we are doing teleconferencing, and this is what we're talking about now. So keep in mind that we want to continue following that 2, 5, and 6 rules, the 2 adults, 5 years older, and the 6 months hospitality. Everything that we talk about Safe Sanctuaries wise that would be true in person is also true online. You still don't want 1 adult and 1 student. You don't want secrecy and that kind of thing. You want to have adults who are trained in Safe Sanctuaries to be your group leaders and those types of things. Use the platform security. So if you're using Zoom, for example, you are able to enable a waiting room like we did today. You're able to enable a password, which also is very helpful. So remember those things and use those, so that will lessen the chance of someone Zoom bombing or whatever it may be your meeting. Use a real name to sign in. Tell people, we may all go by nicknames or whatever, but when you're signing in, use a real name so whoever's operating that waiting room knows exactly who it is that's trying to sign in. And then make sure that only the host can share their screen. That way, something doesn't pop up on your screen that you don't anticipate. Thinking about apps, I think it's important for us as ministry leaders with young people to keep up with the latest apps. Teach parents how to age appropriately download, block, pop in, see what their students are doing online. I think it's really important for us to help parents understand what it is that they can be doing to help keep their children safe online as well. And then be aware, like I said, help parents and students know how to be safe, help students to know that they're not anonymous online, because unfortunately, I think that's what a lot of us think. A lot of our young people growing up in a digital age, they may not have seen what can happen when they think that they're anonymous, and they're not. And so years and years ago, MTV had this public service announcement that I think still holds up today. And it was a young girl had sent her boyfriend a text picture, and then he sent it to all of his friends. And so the tagline was, there's a thin line between him and the whole world. And that's just so true that, you know, it is so, things are so easily spread these days. So you may think that you are sending something to one trusted person or saying something to one trusted person, and then before you know it, it is out there for the whole world to see. So I think that's a really important thing that we can help our students remember. So kind of the basics, like we've talked about, the 2 adult rule, the 5 years older rule, and the 6 months hospitality rule. Those are that's the basics that things that Safe Sanctuaries boils down to. And so now we want to move into talking about what happens when you suspect or see or know of abuse. And so Susan's going to pick up here.
When we are all mandatory reporters, and it's not just reporting if we have seen actual abuse happen, but it's whenever we suspect or call into question whether there is abuse or neglect happening. So this the next few slides will help us think through how we react responsibly when a child or teen discloses abuse that's happening at home or somewhere else, or if we witness or actually discover the abuse ourselves, including child pornography, or when it's just in our gut level and we suspect abuse. And how do we recognize the signs of abuse or observe boundary violations? If someone is repeatedly overstepping those boundaries and you kind of get that feeling in your gut that says, that's overstepping boundaries again, how do we react? Or if you recognize that there has been the signs of abuse that's happening. So how do we react responsibly at those points in time? If you observe or suspect abuse at church or at that child or teen's home, be supportive of the child or teen who's been abused. Don't overreact with anger or disbelief, and document all procedures in handling the allegation, but don't try to investigate yourself. I have just in the past, when I've experienced this, just made mental notes that I've written out. When I get to a point, I can actually write it out, and I listen and hear what the child is saying and try to remember what verbatim the child said that made me suspect the abuse was happening, neglect. If you suspect the abuse is happening there at the church or you see it in a community ministry, don't confront the accused, but just relieve him or her of all the duties in contact with children or teens, and observe strict confidentiality about the person that you saw being abused, an alleged offender. My slide went up too many. You are, as I said, a reporter. In my church, prior to coming out that we were all mandated reporters, I encouraged that actually the pastor or the staff person in charge of children and youth do the actual reporting. However, we cannot do that anymore. But I still encourage whoever suspects it to talk with the pastor, to the staff person responsible for children and youth for that ministry, to be a support person as the volunteer actually calls in and makes that report. If the staff person or the pastor attempt to try to dissuade you not to report, I would just ignore it and go ahead and report. But when you are reporting, if you Google the state child protective services, or you can report to the police, on the slide that I have just updated over the weekend, we actually have the numbers for Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia listed. So you will have that when you get this video. But it will also include if there's a life-threatening emergency, just go ahead and call 911. When you report, it can be a scary thing, particularly if you've never done it before. It's very simple. You are encouraged, and usually the person answering your phone call will ask these questions. But be prepared to tell the child or teen's name and where, if you know their address and where they live. Tell what you saw, why you suspected, what signs or behaviors that call into question, or any actions you actually observed. And they usually will ask whether you know whether the alleged offender has access. My experience in calling Child Protective Services, they may or may not respond immediately. If a child is deemed to be in a safe place, that gives them a few hours before they might respond or contact the alleged offender. If the alleged offender is an immediate access to children and youth, they would probably respond sooner. I have also found that sometimes they deem that it might not be actual abuse or neglect that can be charged, and they might put the information in a file. But it's important, since we are mandated reporters, to go ahead and report. One, I have found that if I report and have a suspicion, but it wasn't deemed necessary to investigate or explore further, and somebody else comes along in another day and calls and reports a suspicion, as those suspicions rise, it might cause that to get a little bit more attention and to investigate further. So never put yourself down for even just reporting, whether you really know or not if there's been abuse. It's important to think about the safety of the children first and to report that immediately, and allow those who do deal with this on a regular basis to investigate further. Any particular questions? One of the other things that we talk about is reporting. Is important to have a plan in place, is to also think about your education procedures and policies, and I think Laura's going to pick up there.
The mute got me again. So it is, like we've talked about earlier, that it is important to have a yearly plan for how we share about safe sanctuaries with our congregations. So one of those is an annual review or orientation. I know back to school time is a really popular time for that. So some of you all have probably just completed those or are getting ready to. And so that is to review your policy, make sure that everyone knows. Important to have them sign off that they agree to live by this policy as leaders in your ministry. Other options for education would be community speakers from nonprofits, government agencies, schools. There are folks who work with children and youth in all different types of roles that could really help us out in thinking through, even just beyond our basic safe sanctuaries. We just finished a webinar series, a 3-part series about adverse childhood experiences and children who have experienced trauma in various ways. Those will also be available on our website, but something like that could be helpful for our leaders as they look at the new year and ways to keep our children and youth safe. Celebrating Children's Sabbath is really important, and as a part of that, we can talk about what it is that we do to keep our children and youth safe. Child Abuse Prevention Month. I know that there is a nonprofit in Blount County that will provide pinwheels for you to put out front for Child Abuse Prevention Month, so that it's important that we do keep in mind that help people to remember that child abuse does happen and that we need to do everything we can to prevent it. Human sexuality education is another part of that. The church has long been an important teacher in that area, and so that is another way that we can help with that yearly educational plan. And some topics are, again, the overview of the policy and procedures. Important to know the facts, those numbers and things about what it is about child abuse. Ways to talk about body, sex, and boundaries for parents and for children. Talking about recognizing the signs of abuse, because that's an important one as well. Cyber safety, and another option would be to have survivors of abuse speak with your students and your leaders. One other thing to mention is that a lot of times churches will have convicted sex offenders who wish to be a part of the life of their congregation. And so, of course, we believe that God's grace is open to all. And so we don't want to exclude anyone from our church. It would mean that that person would not work with children or youth, and it would mean that there are some extra steps that you need to look at for people who are wishing to be a part of our congregation who are convicted sex offenders. And so on that note, if you would like to contact Susan and I to talk through some of those basic steps, but a lot of churches I know have found success in assigning a buddy to someone so that when they are in the church, that person is always with someone, and also setting boundaries within the church that they don't go down the children and youth hallway, those kinds of things. but having a covenant with the person who is coming to be a part of the congregation. So that is something to keep in mind as well. And again, when we make this PowerPoint available, you'll see that there are several different Safe Sanctuaries books that are available through the upper room. And so you'll see all of those. Discipleship Ministries has a series of videos for folks looking at Safe Sanctuaries information into all kinds of different parts and topics, and those could be used in your yearly trainings as well. And so, and then we'll also provide who we use. We at the conference for years have used Track 1 for our background checks, which has now turned into People Facts. But we also have another option now through the conference called Safe Gatherings. And with Safe Gatherings, you can you pay a fee per person, and that covers a quiz that every person that attempts to be certified does, as well as the background check and those types of things. So that may be something that you would be interested in looking into as well.
Laura, we do have a couple of questions in the chat or comments. One asks, could you explain the reasoning behind dismissing the suspected abuser without confronting them? I know that you do have to at least give some rationale, but you don't want to get into a confrontation with the person. And you just want to make sure that they are removed, and you might just say, I saw something, we have to get this checked out. To have another person with you, a pastor or staff person, would be essential before you actually remove that suspected abuser. But it's best to let authorities handle that directly so that you don't escalate any anger, if at all possible. Back to permissions and background checks, I've also often been asked, I'm only working in the kitchen for VBS. Do I need to have the training and or background check that this comes up quite often. And I would say yes, even in working in the kitchen, you have access and you have one-on-one. You don't have necessarily one-on-one, but you are in the presence of children and youth. I encourage churches, even their maintenance staff, go through a background check and also have the training as well. Just anybody who has contact with children and youth in the church need this. And really, as I said, all members need to be aware of the policies and procedures of the church.
And sometimes we do see that people push back, especially on the background check piece, that they're not comfortable with that. I've had a lot of smaller churches say, well, we all know each other. We've all been here for 40 years. We don't need to have a background check. And a lot of times, if you can identify a key person, someone who perhaps the matriarch or the patriarch of the congregation, or the pastor, or whoever it may be that really has some leadership and some maybe social credibility within the congregation, and say, would you please go ahead and do your background check so that other people understand that this is important, and that we know it's not that we suspect anything of you, but it's that we are doing everything we possibly can to keep our children and youth safe. And if you can identify some of those key leaders who are willing to step up and do that, a lot of times that helps other people be more willing to hop on board with that.
Are there any other questions or concerns? As we indicated, this information will be available in the next couple of days on the conference website under Safe Sanctuaries. Laura and I are always available. Feel free to email us or call us directly with your questions or concerns. We appreciate you being a part of this training, and just know we are here to help you. Laura, you want me to close out with prayer?
Sure, go right ahead.
Loving and gracious God, we thank you for this day. We're grateful that you have an opportunity to surround us with your love and care so that we can love and care those that are a part of our congregations. We do want to keep children and youth, and families, and the entire congregation safe and secure, especially during this unprecedented time. We're grateful for each of the leaders that are a part of this Zoom conversation. Surround them with your wisdom, with your discernment, with your keen insight. May we all live into your presence, knowing that you guide and direct us, and you walk with us through any and all situations in life. As we go forth into other responsibilities today, hold us in your love and care. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Somebody did ask for email addresses. It will be on the PowerPoint presentation. We'll try.